Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back to the next set of parallel sessions. I will hand you straight over to Nick. Thanks, Nick.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. My name's Nick Szydlowski. I'm the Digital Scholarship Librarian at San Jose State University. I'm coming to you from Oakland, California today, and I'm really excited to be here at CALC to share some of my research and some thoughts on the topic of critical bibliometrics. And I'm going to do that through a case study of applying critical methods to a study of the library science literature. So here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm first going to give a brief introduction to this idea of critical bibliometrics. I'm going to talk a little bit about why librarians would apply bibliometrics critically and what the context for that might be. And then I'm going to walk through this case study, applying critical bibliometrics to the library science literature. I'll talk a little bit about next steps in my own research and also what I think might be interesting or what other folks might be interested in doing with these kind of critical approaches to bibliometrics and give a little bit of a conclusion. So what is critical bibliometrics? This isn't a term I made up. It's out there in the literature, but not necessarily super widely discussed. Critical bibliometrics, I tend to think, can be sort of one of two things in terms of approaches. It can be bibliometrics work that's critical of bibliometrics methods. So bibliometrics work that tries to demonstrate methodological problems or biases that exist in current research impact metrics. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit here, right? Like if folks are familiar with metrics like journal impact factor or H-index or just general citation count and how those are used, there tends to be a little bit of unreflective use. There tends to be a lot of like relying on these metrics as maybe a little more statistically grounded than they are. But I will say that the work that I'm most interested in is kind of in the second category, which is research that uses bibliometrics methods to interrogate power dynamics and other dynamics that might shape scholarly communication and knowledge production. So using bibliometric methods as a critical research method or as a method that's interested in how power works within knowledge production, within scholarly communication, within sort of the study of the journal literature and how that develops. So a little bit practically about why these methods might be relevant to librarians. If anyone in the audience has worked, as I have, as like a scholarly communication or research impact librarian, or even in a role where that's like part of your role, you might know that librarians are often called on to perform sort of bibliometric analysis, whether that's at the individual level, department level, institutional level. And the tools that we have at our disposal for that can be kind of flawed and limited. I like to use this kind of cartoon that, these are not unique ideas, that there are some flaws in these kind of metrics. So as an example, like a lot of universities, some departments of my own university use journal impact factor, which is like the number of citations per article that a journal receives as a measure of, how good the publications of an individual faculty member might be, right? But it is, this is sort of, if you're judging, it's just, really not a metric that measures what you're looking at there. And so, there's a lot of criticism of these metrics. And they can also kind of embed the assumptions that are based on power dynamics within the environment, right? So if you're comparing, one of the common criticisms also is if you're comparing, say, like citation counts across fields or even across subfields, you're going to see dramatic differences just based on how big a field is, what the funding environment around a field is that's like driving a high rate of publication and therefore a high rate of citation. So if you compare like a STEM field to a humanities field, or even like subfields within the same field, you're going to see dramatic differences in those numbers. But taking this kind of a step further in how we might think of it, I do want to share. So taking a step further, we might think too that like these bibliometrics are just part of a broader kind of metric environment that a lot of us sort of swim in higher education, especially. And without going into tons and tons of detail about that, I want to share this book, Engines of Anxiety by Espeland and Sauter, which I think is a big influence on my own thinking and work in this area. This is a book that looks at kind of how the ranking environment in US law schools has impacted educational priorities, has impacted practices. And bibliometrics are really just a piece of this kind of metric environment that influences the education environment that we're in. So, taking a critical approach can be important in kind of cutting through some of this discourse or discussion. So I'll just say briefly sort of my own origin story, because I think it helps kind of connect these ideas to practice. So in my prior role, I worked as a scholarly communications librarian in a US law school for about 10 years. And that job included analysis related to the rankings and to faculty bibliometrics. And I got this question that kind of set me off in this research direction. I was asked to identify subfields within legal scholarship which might be undervalued in what was seen as like the prestige economy of law schools. So fields that might have high citation numbers but relatively low prestige. So the very high prestige fields are very hard to hire in. So if folks are sports fans, or I don't know if this might be an American reference, but I was sort of asked to do like a Moneyball analysis or like a how can we get a cost effectively hire a faculty member who might have high citation numbers. And that kind of like it opened my mind to, just how much these kind of metrics are affecting behavior, right? Um, and so that, doing that study kind of internally, this is some, graphing work from that study, but it kind of got me thinking about these kind of bigger questions that we might actually be able to use bibliometric data to answer. So we might ask, like, which subfields are central, which are marginalized? How do citation behaviors or gaming behaviors shape the perception of fields and subfields? And how can we use kind of bibliometrics to maybe like understand fields that we're not part of better and do analysis that's like really insightful and kind of is able to identify some of these dynamics rather than sort of staying on the surface of just sort of citation counts and that kind of thing. So, so for me, this kind of has both like a practical application and a research application. I think they're both important. Um, so I'm going to talk about this case study, and hopefully that will sort of illustrate, if some of what I'm talking about is not clear, hopefully this will sort of illustrate what it might mean to use bibliometrics critically. So the goal of this case study was to take sort of a familiar literature. So choosing the library science literature was primarily because like the audience for this would be other librarians, thinking of looking at a familiar literature using a new set of methods and seeing if the results are interesting, if the results seem worth applying these methods to other fields. So the data set was retrieved from Web of Science using the Boolean search that's listed here. So the goal was to get a data set that kind of encapsulated the field of library science um, for this time period. Web of Science has these sort of useful journal level field metadata that helps, especially a field like libraries, right, where library is a very common word. It's used a lot in computer science. So trying to isolate the literature that's really about libraries, these WC, which is these like journal level field delimiters, are really helpful. And I'm not going to probably have time to explore like the full methods of this, but this study has been published. It's an open access article. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, the link is here, and it's again at the end of the slides. It was published in Journal of Academic Librarianship. So I'll just go quickly through sort of the methodology here. Again, this is kind of introducing what these methods might be. I think the idea of critical bibliometrics borrows a lot from fields like critical data studies and also from digital humanities in terms of fields that try to use quantitative methods, but in a critical way. I'll put it that way. So the methodology for this specific study uses open source software. The first step was to use software called VOS Viewer to build out the citation network. So taking the data from Web of Science, VOS Viewer is able to connect the articles that cite one another. I then brought that data into another network analysis tool called Gephi to perform what's called a cluster analysis. So mathematically to identify clusters of similar articles based purely on their citation characteristics. So there's not a semantic aspect here. It's just which ones are similar based on citing one another. And then the third step was that kind of semantic analysis. So taking just the titles and using a tool called Voyant tools to do a little bit of text analysis on the titles to help describe the clusters and kind of work with them more on the level of meaning, and also to kind of test whether that citation network approach really gave semantic clusters. Right, because you could have an approach that gave you clusters, but they weren't really semantically consistent. So one of the things that jumped right out in the results from this study was the impact of self-citation. And so this is going to be kind of one of the themes of the analysis here. In the initial cluster analysis, it was very clear right away that there was a very high degree of journal level self-citation in one journal. That journal is Library High Tech. And so within this network, 78% of the citations to articles in Library High Tech originated from other Library High Tech articles. And then looking in more detail at Library High Tech, you could see that there was a bit of a strategy of different ways of conducting, different ways of publishing to make sure that the articles were regularly citing one another, including that like each issue includes a introduction that formally cites all the other articles in here. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about, one of the criticisms and one of the concerns about metrics, right, is that they invite gaming in a certain way, gaming or manipulation. And my goal here is not necessarily to call out Library High Tech, because I think this is like a feature, not a bug of the system in a lot of ways. But in order to achieve like semantically meaningful clusters, the citations had to be weighted so that self-citations were worth less than external citations. And then making that shift in the analysis using Gephi, it was possible to come up with kind of a pretty meaningful set of clusters in this network. So here's an image of what this weighted network ended up looking like. It featured 23 clusters with 20 or more articles each. And the next step was sort of to describe them both like statistically and in terms of a set of distinctive words that was generated using Voyant. I'm going to share a few of these example clusters just to give you a sense of what they were. I don't want to give you the full list of 20 of them. So a cluster around information literacy was, I think, the largest one. It included kind of an average number of citations. And these were some of its distinctive words. So, consistent with the idea that this cluster is, semantically about information literacy. There's a second cluster about diversity, also large, lower than average number of citations, and centrality, which are quite closely linked mathematically. And you can see its distinctive words. And then a cluster around research on artificial intelligence, which received like a quite high number of citations, fairly central to the network. We'll talk a little bit more about kind of what that might mean. Um, one of the like clearest findings that pulled out of this, kind of after doing this cluster analysis, was that the literature on public libraries is quite isolated from the literature on academic libraries, and the literature in this network, the literature on academic libraries really sort of dominates. So this graph over here, and I'll show a bigger version of it in a second, this comes out of Voyant, and it represents for each cluster, so each line here represents a cluster in the network. The blue areas show where the term academic appears in the title, and orange areas show where the word public appears in the title. So you have a pretty clear visualization here that there's basically one cluster out of the 20 that focuses very much on public libraries. Academic libraries are sort of distributed throughout. There's a few clusters that have, relatively small representations of public. Let me show that again, the next slide. Yeah, and so I think this is helpful. I think this is this is a finding that might be very intuitive to people who work in the field, right? But if you were coming into a field like LIS from outside, you might not know that there's, in effect, like so little citation interaction between public and academic libraries, and that the focus of the literature is so, I would say, disproportionately on academic libraries. So again, so moving on in describing the clusters, one way to think about them is that a lot of them, some of them relate to themes and others relate to practice areas. And this is again not around the specific articles, but a description of like what is sort of the semantic center of each cluster. So here you've got a graph showing the network and then highlighted some of the bigger clusters that organized around themes. So themes like COVID-19 is orange, diversity, the light blue, and then the red is the burnout. And you can see, or so a cluster centered around research on employee burnout. I think it's meaningful to see, right, that those clusters are the diversity and the employee burnout clusters are, quite physically in the quote unquote physically in the network located near to one another, indicating that there's some level of kind of cross citation between them. Um, Themes or clusters related to practice areas are highlighted on this map or on this diagram here. So you can see the public libraries down here in yellow. We've got information literacy up here in orange. I won't list these all. And then having divided the themes up kind of according to, or dividing the clusters up according to whether they center around themes or practice areas, it's possible to make this diagram that shows kind of in orange the clusters around practice areas and in blue the clusters around themes. And sort of trying to clarify this analysis, right? This does many articles in LIS actually combine a theme and a cluster and a practice area. But what we see here that I think is interesting, right, is that the theme clusters tend to kind of gravitate towards the center of this network. The practice area clusters kind of hang on the outside. So in some ways, like you can describe the field in some ways as sort of organized around this idea of themes emerging, being connected to these practice areas, and you can get like a little bit of a visualization of how this works. Again, it's like a qualitative sense of how the field might work. So thinking and kind of moving towards the end, thinking about findings, journal self-citation has a large impact. I think it's fair to say I at least think of LIS as sort of like a gentle field. It's not like an extremely competitive academic field compared to some. And so it's interesting to see that even in a field like LIS, there is this level of gaming and manipulation that if you don't detect it, it really affects the metrics that you're seeing. And I've included some quotes from the literature review in the article, just so you can see kind of how there's a lot of great kind of criticism about how when you get gaming and when you get manipulation in these metrics, the metrics cease to become sort of meaningful as what they are, and they're more reflective of like the behaviors that the metric itself is producing. Another observation that I want to highlight and kind of thinking about like what critical bibliometrics might be used for, what we might do with it. The technology themes are very highly cited, right? And we can say in some part this might be due to like the self-citation practices at Library High Tech. But I think, the proportion shows that there's maybe a little bit more than this. And it's particularly notable when you compare to the clusters related to like COVID-19 and especially like diversity and employee burnout, which I think folks who were in the field during this period, at least I would recognize like those were major, major themes in the literature. And we're not seeing them receive as many citations as something like AI. And maybe a traditional bibliometric approach would be to say, so there must be something very impactful or very important about this AI literature. And I think a critical approach might say, well, what is going on in the field that we're seeing this difference between these two, I think, clearly important um, trends in the field. And this might point to, I think, folks who work in kind of critical areas might say, well, it's very hard to get critical work published in LIS. This study doesn't prove that, but I think, I'm trying to bring that out to contrast like what a difference between a critical approach and a more conventional approach might be. So again, a critical approach might be one where we say that the bibliometrics, or we take as sort of a given that the bibliometrics are going to reflect the power dynamics within the field. So if you're using these methods in a field you're in, this analysis can kind of help to demonstrate dynamics which you understand and intuit as a member of the field, but which are rarely expressed. So I think that's what that public library example is really interesting here. Um, Folks in the field may know this, but how do you demonstrate it to someone outside the field or show that it's real as opposed to sort of like an internal, you know, um, sense or grievance? For those outside of a given field, you can use these methods to kind of get at or reveal dynamics within a field that are really difficult to get at using the conventional bibliometric methods. I'm going to talk really briefly about some work in progress I have, because I think part of what I want to share here is, right, like this is a set of methods or some ways of thinking about bibliometrics that I think has a lot of applications. I hope others will maybe like take it up as a research method. So considering bibliometrics metrics as a critical tool lets you ask kind of different questions. So one of the next things I'm working on is a study of bibliodiversity at the national level. There's a little graph from that study, or a little map that shows published level biodiversity at the national level. And so folks who work in scholarly communications might not be surprised that like the publisher level diversity in Latin America is dramatically higher than most of the other, or at least, demonstrably higher, I should say, than most of the rest of the world. Um, and I'll close up with some sort of hypothesis for future research. I think critical bibliometrics might help us kind of get at. So this idea that metrics and rankings are routinely gamed and manipulated by those with the resources to do so, I think that's becoming more and more true, and it's important to kind of build that into our analyses, any analysis that uses bibliometrics. The idea that you can't just use bibliometrics don't only measure sort of impact or some kind of objective sense of the importance of the research, but they're a record of the ways that power dynamics shape systems of scholarly communication and knowledge production. So, for instance, we're seeing huge changes in the research environment in the US. That's going to shake out in sort of bibliometric approach, bibliometric results that we get within the next few years. How do we measure for that? How do we think about that in terms of documenting that? And then more broadly, I think that understanding how knowledge production works, like how at a system level, a system like scholarly communication works, this is sort of a big question for LIS. Like I think this is a question that's within the domain of LIS that we should be asking, and that critical perspectives can help us unpack dynamics that exist that are maybe not detected at the surface level with some of the methods that we're used to using for bibliometrics. So I meant to leave a little time for questions. I don't think I left a whole lot, but maybe there's time for one. If folks are interested in this kind of work, I'd love to hear from you. Here's my contact, and here's the article link. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. We've got about 6-ish minutes for questions. So yeah, plenty of time for questions
Oh,
if
okay, great.
anybody does have anything. If you'd like to either put your hand up or put something into the chat. One thing that kind of struck me that I guess because you mentioned it a couple of times is the amount of self-citations in library high tech. So did you have any theories as to why that was?
So my I think, I did look at library high tech after this, like go and look at the publication patterns. And I mean, I believe, I don't have evidence for this, that it's a strategy. I think it's a common strategy in journals to encourage self-citation to the journal. And, if you look at their sort of journal citation reports from publishers, that kind of thing, you do see this big spike in their sort of self-citations during this period. So I've seen this in other journals that I've kind of worked with, and so it's not an uncommon pattern to say like, here's a strategy for how we're going to rate the impact factor of the journal. Let's encourage our authors to cite previous articles within the same journal. And I mean, part of what I want to get at with this too is like, I don't want to sort of like wave my finger at them and say like that's misbehavior. Like it is gaming the system, but it also like that is invited by this kind of bibliometrics work. And one of the the Cesar article that is kind of quoted on one of these slides talks about how even at the beginning of when in the kind of 1960s, 1970s, when some of these metrics were being developed, the idea that this would change behavior at the publisher level, at the researcher level, was sort of built into what people expected from kind of building a system that involved more metrics. And there are a lot of behaviors, the article talks about this a little too, like there are a lot of these kind of strategic behaviors that are widely accepted that also are sort of like, if you step back, are kind of gaming behavior. So like salami slicing is a good example, right? If you're a researcher and you do a study, there's an incentive to break the study up into as many small articles as you can, and then all those articles obviously cite one another and build up your own metrics. And that's, that's accepted in most fields. Like that's the strategy. Um, I even had a researcher at one point tell me, the strategy in their field is to identify the quantum amount of research that can go into an article. So like the smallest possible amount of research that fits in an article. And each article contains that tiny amount of research. And as a librarian, it's kind of painful, right? Because like as a reader, it's impossible to then piece the research back together. Like what you would really want is like one article that contains the study and tells the story. Um, so I just I don't want to go overboard on like shaming library high tech because I think that like this is the world we're in, right?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Not seeing any other. Oh, okay. Great question in the chat. Do you think alt metrics are any better from a gamification perspective? That's a question coming from someone who doesn't really work in the
Oh
bibliometric
yeah, no, that's a
field.
great question because I mean I think alt metrics, right, I think altmetrics carry the same set of problems. I think that they're probably a little bit harder to game, but they do, reflect the same kind of like power dynamics that you would see in this kind of in the conventional research metric. So I think one good thing about altmetrics is like when we say that impact factor measures something like public impact of research, altmetrics might be better at actually measuring public impact in the sense that like altmetrics, well, for folks who aren't as familiar with altmetrics, right? They're typically things like how many times has an article been used on social media? How many times has an article been, or an author appeared in media appearances, that kind of thing. So essentially like sort of a public science or public humanities, public kind of facing research. So I think alt metrics are probably certainly better at measuring that than citations within the literature are. But then they very much reflect what the media is interested in a certain way. So I don't think has ever ended up in an article, but I've done something where I sort of counted out. It used to be like an alt metrics top 100, and it's in very, very STEM focused. You'll see a few sort of more like social science fields. You won't see any like humanities research get into this sort of altmetrics top 100, right? And so then, there's a that reflects sort of the interests of the media outlets that are generating the interest in these kind of articles. Um,
Yeah, we've got time for one more question if you can do it
oh
fairly
yeah, I can read
quickly.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll read it out. So how many of these commercially owned bibliometric services do you think are designed with a commercial goal in mind? Um, Yes, absolutely. I'll just leave it at that. Absolutely. Yes. So the commercial owned bibliometric services are very much commercial products. A lot of them are trademarked, like Impact Factor and others. And I mean, one thing you'll hear from companies like Elsevier and Springer, I've heard this directly from Elsevier, right, is that they think of themselves, and when they talk to their shareholders, they think of themselves as like data companies. And so being seen as like data and tech companies that sell back to universities these metrics is very important to like how their kind of value proposition to stockholders as companies. So I think, yeah, they're very much interested in um, selling back metrics that are potentially useful in like university processes or that kind of thing. Um, and and I see a tinfoil hat is right. I mean, that this is the journal publishing is not necessarily seen as a glamorous business in the same way that like selling data or being a data broker or being a data collector is. So this is kind of a different area, but it is, yeah, these metrics are not coming from a place of um, purity of heart or something like that. They're a commercial enterprise. They're part of the product.
Right, that is perfectly on time. So thank you so much to Nick, and I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking Nick. And Nicole, if you would like to come along and bring up your slides, and I will pass straight over to you. Thank you.